In the spring of 1942, as Japanese forces swept across the Pacific with seemingly unstoppable momentum, a small group of officers in Tokyo faced a terrifying reality that contradicted every victory bulletin broadcast to the nation. They had intercepted American communications. They had broken certain naval codes. They had agents scattered across Asia. Yet they were blind. Systematically, catastrophically blind. While American codebreakers at Pearl Harbor and later at Midway were reading Japanese naval messages almost in real time, Japan's intelligence services were fracturing under the weight of inter-service rivalry so toxic that Army and Navy officers would rather see their nation defeated than share information with each other. Consider this. Before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese intelligence failed to locate even a single American aircraft carrier. At Midway, they believed the Americans had only 2 carriers in the Pacific when 4 were bearing down on them. By 1944, Japanese commanders were making life and death decisions based on intelligence estimates that weren't just wrong. They were inverted reflections of reality, fantasy maps drawn over a world they refused to see. This wasn't simple incompetence. This was institutional blindness elevated to the level of national policy, a systematic failure so complete that it becomes almost incomprehensible. How does a modern military power, one capable of projecting force across an entire ocean, become so divorced from reality that its leaders make decisions in a fog of their own creation? How does an empire wage total war while its intelligence agencies wage war against each other? The roots of Japan's intelligence catastrophe stretched back decades before Pearl Harbor, embedded in the very structure of the Japanese military establishment. Unlike the Americans or British, who would eventually centralize their intelligence operations under unified commands, Japan entered World War II with a Byzantine labyrinth of competing agencies that shared nothing but mutual contempt. The Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy each maintained completely separate intelligence organizations. They used different codes, cultivated different agent networks, analyzed threats through incompatible frameworks, and guarded their findings with paranoid jealousy. This wasn't bureaucratic inefficiency. This was institutionalized sabotage. Army intelligence officers stationed in the same cities as their Navy counterparts would let naval colleagues walk into disasters rather than share warnings that might give the Navy credit for a success. The rivalry was so profound that the services maintained duplicate spy networks in the same countries, with Japanese agents sometimes surveilling each other instead of the enemy. In Shanghai, in Singapore, in Manila, Japanese intelligence officers wasted precious resources watching their own countrymen. The structural problems ran deeper still. Japan had no equivalent to America's Office of Strategic Services or Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, no civilian intelligence agency capable of providing independent analysis free from military doctrine. Intelligence assessment was left to serving officers whose careers depended on telling superiors what they wanted to hear. Junior intelligence officers who reported inconvenient truths, who suggested American industrial capacity might prove overwhelming, or that British resistance in Asia might stiffen, found themselves reassigned to remote garrisons or worse. The system rewarded optimism and punished realism. By 1941, as Japan finalized plans for its southern offensive, the intelligence picture presented to decision-makers in Tokyo bore almost no resemblance to reality. Estimates of American naval strength were systematically understated. British defensive preparations in Malaya were dismissed. The Soviet Union's intentions remained a cipher despite the massive Kwantung Army positioned in Manchuria specifically to counter Soviet threats. Japanese war planning proceeded in an information vacuum, a void that Japan's intelligence services had created through their own dysfunction. The fractured mirror could reflect only fragments, and in those fragments, Japanese commanders saw what they wished to see, an enemy weak, divided, and ripe for conquest. The attack on Pearl Harbor, remembered as Japan's greatest tactical triumph, was also a stunning intelligence failure that presaged everything to follow. Japanese planners had obsessed over every detail of the strike itself, the torpedo modifications for shallow water, the bombing patterns, the precise timing of the dawn assault. Yet they launched this war-defining operation, while fundamentally ignorant of their enemy's dispositions. Not one of the American aircraft carriers, the true strategic prizes of the Pacific Fleet, was in harbor that morning. Japanese intelligence had not located them. This was not for lack of effort in collection. Japan had maintained an active espionage network in Hawaii for years, centered around the Japanese consulate in Honolulu. Agent reports flowed back to Tokyo detailing ship movements, shore leave patterns, even the placement of anti-aircraft batteries. But collection without analysis is merely noise, and Tokyo's intelligence bureaus proved incapable of transforming raw data into actionable insight. The reports sat in files, were summarized poorly, and were filtered through layers of officers who understood neither naval aviation nor American operational patterns. More damning still was the failure of imagination. Japanese intelligence officers, trained in a navy that viewed battleships as the ultimate arbiters of naval supremacy, could not conceive that the Americans might think differently. When their agents reported that American carriers were frequently absent from Pearl Harbor, conducting exercises at sea, Japanese planners saw confirmation that carriers were secondary vessels, unsuitable for a decisive battle. They saw what their doctrine told them to see: the possibility that the Americans were specifically training a carrier-centric force for Pacific operations, that the battleship fleet in harbor might be the decoy and not the prize, never seriously entered Japanese calculations. The post-attack intelligence failure was equally severe. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft photographed the harbor's devastation, confirming the destruction of 8 battleships. But they failed to adequately assess the one target that mattered most: Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities and repair infrastructure. Had Japanese commanders understood that destroying these installations would cripple American Pacific operations for a year or more, they might have launched follow-up strikes. Instead, operating without proper intelligence about what actually constituted vital American vulnerabilities, they withdrew after the first wave's success. They had struck a devastating tactical blow while missing the strategic target entirely, and they didn't even realize it. By June of 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had conquered an empire stretching from Burma to the Central Pacific. Yet this string of victories had created a dangerous feedback loop in Tokyo's intelligence apparatus. Success confirmed pre-war assumptions about American weakness and Japanese superiority. Reports that contradicted this narrative, suggestions that American industrial mobilization was proceeding faster than anticipated, or that American morale remained unbroken, were dismissed or suppressed. Japanese intelligence had become a mirror reflecting only what commanders wanted to see. Nowhere would this prove more catastrophic than at Midway. Admiral Yamamoto's plan to seize the island and force a decisive fleet engagement was premised on intelligence estimates that were not merely wrong, but inverted. Japanese intelligence believed the Americans had at most 2 aircraft carriers available in the Pacific. The actual number was 4, including the Yorktown, which Japanese intelligence had assessed as sunk after the Battle of the Coral Sea. This wasn't a minor miscalculation. This was a fundamental misunderstanding of American capabilities and intentions that should have been impossible for a competent intelligence service to make. The failure had multiple causes. Japanese naval intelligence had indeed broken some American codes, but their code-breaking operation was understaffed, under-resourced, and subordinated to operational commands that ignored inconvenient intercepts. When American codebreakers changed procedures or Japanese operators misread translations, no one in Tokyo noticed the intelligence going dark. Meanwhile, the operational security around the Midway plan was so lax that American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii were reading Japanese fleet communications almost in real time, tracking the buildup and predicting the attack vector with stunning accuracy. Japanese intelligence assumed their codes were secure because acknowledging otherwise would require admitting failure. The battle itself unfolded exactly as American intelligence had predicted, and nothing like Japanese intelligence had forecast. When Japanese scouts finally spotted American carriers northeast of Midway, Admiral Nagumo's reaction was not merely surprise, but shock and disbelief. Where had these carriers come from? How had they positioned themselves so perfectly? Japanese commanders were making tactical decisions in real time based on an understanding of the battle that was 6 months out of date. By sunset on June 4, 1942, 4 Japanese fleet carriers lay at the bottom of the Pacific, along with hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots and aircrew. It was the turning point of the Pacific War, a defeat that Japanese intelligence had failed to foresee, failed to prevent, and afterwards failed to accurately report to the Japanese people. While naval intelligence floundered in the Pacific, Japanese army intelligence was drowning in China, trapped in a war it couldn't understand and couldn't end. Since 1937, Japanese forces had conquered China's major cities and controlled its eastern coastline. Yet the war dragged on, consuming men and material with no resolution in sight. Japanese intelligence had failed to grasp the fundamental nature of the conflict they had initiated. This was not a conventional war that could be won by seizing capitals and crushing field armies. This was a people's war, and Japanese intelligence agencies had no framework for comprehending it. The Army's intelligence services in China were vast in scale, but shallow in understanding. They could report troop movements and order of battle for nationalist forces. They maintained networks of collaborators in occupied territories. They conducted brutal counterinsurgency sweeps based on intelligence that identified communist base areas. But they could not answer the basic questions that mattered. How strong was Chinese will to resist? How effectively were the communists mobilizing peasant populations? What level of support was reaching China through the Burma Road and later the Hump Airlift? Could Chiang Kai-shek's government be split from its American backers? Part of this failure stemmed from cultural blindness. Japanese intelligence officers, products of a rigidly hierarchical society, struggled to comprehend horizontal organizational structures like those employed by the Chinese communists. They consistently underestimated guerrilla forces because such forces didn't fit their doctrinal understanding of how armies should operate. They interpreted Chinese civilian sullen compliance in occupied areas as acceptance rather than survival strategy. Most critically, they failed to understand the degree to which their own occupation policies, the massacres, the forced labor, the economic exploitation, were creating the very resistance networks that intelligence was tasked with destroying. The failure extended to strategic intelligence about Allied intentions. When American forces began building up in China-Burma-India theater, Japanese intelligence failed to accurately assess the scale or purpose of the operation. Was this preparation for a major offensive into Burma? A supply route to sustain Chinese resistance? A platform for strategic bombing of the Japanese home islands? Japanese intelligence provided no clear answers, and in the absence of understanding, Japanese commanders in China pursued contradictory strategies that squandered resources and accomplished nothing. By 1944, the China theater had become an intelligence black hole, absorbing men and material while providing no actionable insight. The Ichigo offensive of that year, Japan's largest ground operation of the war, was planned and executed with almost no reliable intelligence about Chinese capabilities or American intentions. It succeeded tactically and meant nothing strategically. By 1945, as American forces closed in on the Japanese home islands, the intelligence failure had become total. Japanese commanders were making decisions based on fantasy. Intelligence estimates claimed that American morale was cracking under the strain of island-hopping campaigns, that the American public would not tolerate an invasion of Japan itself, that the Soviet Union would remain neutral or could be persuaded to mediate a negotiated peace. Every one of these assessments was catastrophically wrong, and everyone was believed because the alternative, accepting the reality of absolute defeat, was psychologically impossible for Japan's military leadership. The intelligence services themselves were fragmenting. With communications networks shattered by American bombing and submarine campaigns, field commands operated in isolation, making decisions without coordination or oversight. Intelligence summaries reaching Tokyo, when they arrived at all, were days or weeks out of date. Accurate casualty reports were suppressed to maintain morale. The true scale of merchant shipping losses was concealed even from naval command. The intelligence picture had become so distorted that Japanese leaders were planning defensive operations based on military forces that no longer existed and counting on resources that had already been sunk. Most tragically, Japanese intelligence failed at the one task where it might have made a difference: assessing Allied intentions regarding occupation and post-war treatment. American intelligence operations had infiltrated Japan itself through neutral countries, intercepting communications and recruiting sources within the Japanese government. Yet Japanese counterintelligence was so focused on internal thought control, on rooting out defeatism and ideological impurity, that it missed actual espionage. The Kempeitai, military police, were arresting peace advocates and liberal professors while American agents operated undetected. Japanese intelligence had turned inward, becoming an instrument of regime preservation rather than national security. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, Japanese intelligence had provided no warning. They had known the Americans were working on some form of advanced weapon, had intercepted references to the Manhattan Project, but had failed to grasp the scale or urgency of the program. Japanese scientific intelligence had concluded that atomic weapons were theoretical curiosities years away from practical deployment. They were wrong. The final intelligence failure was also the most absolute. Japan surrendered without truly understanding the weapon that had made surrender inevitable. The failure of Japanese intelligence in World War II was not a story of inadequate technology or insufficient resources. Japan had skilled cryptographers, dedicated intelligence officers, and extensive agent networks. What they lacked was the institutional structure and cultural framework to use intelligence effectively. The inter-service rivalry, the suppression of inconvenient truths, the subordination of analysis to operational wishful thinking, these were not technical problems. They were failures of national character, institutional rot, that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. The consequences extended far beyond military defeat. The intelligence failures meant that Japanese leaders made decisions throughout the war based on fundamental misunderstandings of enemy capabilities and intentions. They launched campaigns that were doomed from inception, held positions long past the point of military utility, and rejected surrender negotiations because they believed in a strategic situation that existed only in their own reports. The human cost of these failures, measured in Japanese lives lost in futile defensive battles and civilians who died in the final months of a war already lost, is incalculable. Perhaps most sobering is the realization that these failures were predictable, even predicted. Western observers in the 1930s had noted the fractures within Japan's military establishment. Japanese reformers had warned of the dangers of inter-service rivalry and the suppression of dissent. But the warnings went unheeded because they threatened powerful interests and contradicted comfortable assumptions. In the end, Japanese intelligence failed not because it lacked information, but because it could not accept the truth that information revealed. That the empire was built on foundations far more fragile than anyone in Tokyo dared admit. The invisible defeat, the collapse of intelligence, had determined the outcome long before the final battles were fought. Japan had gone to war blind, and blindness ensured that every victory would be temporary and every defeat would be final.